Most people think of killers as shadows lurking in alleys or nameless figures in crowded cities. But the truth? Some of the most disturbing predators in history were not hiding at all. They walked into homes, lived among neighbors, and smiled at strangers who never guessed what they were capable of. One stalked Scotland's quiet towns in the 1950s, slipping into houses where families thought they were safe. Another turned a farm on the edge of Canada into a graveyard, preying on women who society already overlooked. And one was a woman who murdered for no reason other than the thrill of it, proving evil does not belong to any one face, gender, or decade. These are three of the most chilling killers you've never truly heard about. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because these stories will stay with you long after this video ends. In the years after World War II, Scotland was trying to rebuild itself, patching up not only its economy, but the sense of safety that had been eroded by years of bombs, rations, and loss. Families locked their doors at night, but most still believed that danger came from far away, from war and politics, not from the quiet man walking down their own street. That illusion was shattered in the 1950s by Manuel, a killer so ruthless and unpredictable that newspapers would later call him the Beast of Birkenshaw. Born in New York in 1927 to Scottish immigrants before returning with his family to Lanarkshire, Scotland, Manuel seemed unremarkable at first glance. A working-class man, intelligent but restless, capable of blending into pubs and neighborhoods without raising alarm. Yet beneath that exterior lay a deep cruelty that emerged early. As a teenager, he stalked local women, breaking into houses to assault them, crimes that hinted at his appetite for control and violence. His early offenses earned him time in prison, but confinement did little to change him. In fact, like many predators, Manuel used prison as a place to sharpen his mind, reading law books and learning how to manipulate systems to his advantage. When he was finally free in the mid-1950s, he was more dangerous than ever. He began prowling the suburbs and towns around Glasgow and Lanarkshire, breaking into homes at night not just to steal but to kill. His victims ranged from lone women to entire families, and his ability to move silently through neighborhoods turned bedrooms, the most private, intimate spaces, into killing grounds. In 1956, the Watt family of three were found dead in their own home, gunned down with chilling precision. In another case, he murdered a young woman named Anne Kenealens on a golf course, her body discovered in the cold winter grass. These murders seemed random at first, but investigators began to see a pattern. Manuel killed without hesitation, without consistent motive, and without mercy. What terrified Scotland most was that Manuel didn't strike in alleys or abandoned buildings. He walked into homes, places people believed were safe from the world's dangers, and left behind blood-stained reminders that nowhere was safe when he was near. As the 1950s progressed, Scotland found itself living under a shadow that seemed impossible to dispel, because Manuel was not only killing, but doing so with an arrogance that mocked the very system trying to stop him. His crimes escalated from assaults and burglaries to murders that left entire communities gripped with fear. The Watt family killings in 1956 had already made headlines, but they were far from his only atrocity. Manuel targeted women and families alike, slipping into houses as though locks and walls meant nothing, often killing with cold efficiency before vanishing back into the ordinary world. One of his most brazen crimes came in 1958, when he murdered the Smart family in Uddingston, Peter, his wife Doris, and their 10-year-old son Michael, shooting them all in their sleep. For days afterward, Manuel lived in their home, eating their food, driving their car, and pretending as though nothing had happened, a chilling act of defiance that revealed not only his lack of remorse, but his desire to dominate his victims even after death. Investigators were baffled and enraged, chasing leads that went nowhere, struggling to prove connections between the murders because Manuel left little physical evidence and seemed always one step ahead. Yet what truly unsettled police was the way Manuel interacted with them. He followed the press coverage of his crimes closely, even feeding false information to investigators, and at one point taunted officers by hinting at knowledge only the killer could have. It was as though Manuel relished the game, playing cat and mouse with authorities while entire neighborhoods locked their doors and whispered of the Beast of Birkenshaw. Women feared walking alone at night, and families no longer felt safe in their beds. The randomness of his crimes made the terror even worse. No one could predict who he would strike next. For law enforcement, the case became not only about catching a killer, but about restoring public trust in a Scotland that seemed under siege by one man's violence. Still, despite the growing panic, Manuel managed to evade justice for years, leaving behind only bodies and questions that piled up faster than answers. The downfall of Peter Manuel came not because he lost the will to kill, but because his arrogance finally outpaced his caution. After the murder of the Smart family in 1958, suspicion around him grew too loud to ignore. Police had long kept him on their radar, aware of his criminal past and uncanny ability to slip through the cracks, but now the evidence began to close in. Witnesses placed him near crime scenes, and inconsistencies in his alibis piled up. When investigators finally brought him in for questioning, Manuel displayed the same cold confidence that had defined his life. He studied law while in prison and fancied himself clever enough to manipulate the system, often speaking with an air of superiority that infuriated detectives. But this arrogance backfired. Rather than hiding his crimes, Manuel eventually confessed to 8 murders, laying them out with chilling detail as though recounting mundane tasks. At his trial, he insisted on defending himself, addressing the court directly and attempting to outwit the prosecution. Instead, his self-importance only highlighted his guilt. In May of 1958, Peter Manuel was convicted and sentenced to death. On July 11th of that year, he was hanged at Barlinnie Prison in Glasgow, bringing an end to one of Scotland's most terrifying killing sprees. For the people of Lanarkshire and beyond, his execution provided closure but not relief. The scars he left remained etched in the collective memory of communities that had once believed themselves safe in their own homes. Manuel's story is remembered not only for the brutality of his crimes, but for the fear he instilled. The sense that danger could step across your threshold uninvited, wearing the face of a man who seemed ordinary until it was too late. And while Scotland grappled with the terror left in his wake, half a world away, Canada faced its own nightmare decades later. There, in the 1990s and early 2000s, another killer was building a reputation far darker than Manuel's. A pig farmer on the outskirts of Vancouver who lured women from the city's most vulnerable neighborhoods to his farm, a place that would become synonymous with horror. His name was Robert Pickton, and his story remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Canadian criminal history. On the outskirts of Vancouver, in the quiet suburb of Port Coquitlam, sat a pig farm that looked unremarkable to most who passed by. But behind the fences, hidden in the mud and filth, Robert Willie Pickton built one of the darkest crime scenes in Canadian history. Born in 1949, Pickton grew up on that very farm, a boy raised in squalor under the rule of domineering parents who cared little for appearances or discipline. From an early age, he was considered odd, awkward, and slow, struggling in school and retreating into the isolation of farm life. By adulthood, he and his brother owned and ran the family's pig farm, a place that became both a business and a fortress of secrecy. What unsettled neighbors most was not just the mess of the property, littered with abandoned cars, garbage, and rusting machinery, but the stream of vulnerable women who were seen going in and never coming out. Pickton preyed on women from Vancouver's downtown east side, an area known for poverty, drug addiction, and marginalized sex workers. Many of these women had already been overlooked by society, their disappearances too easily dismissed as choices rather than alarms. Pickton understood this invisibility and exploited it. Offering drugs, money, or simply a ride to his farm, he lured women into his world and then erased them completely. For years, families reported their loved ones missing, but because of stigma and systemic neglect, their voices went unheard. Meanwhile, Pickton continued his horrifying pattern, boasting later to an undercover officer that he had killed nearly 50 women, but lost count after reaching that staggering number. His farm became the backdrop for a killing spree so vast that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it when the truth came to light. The pigs, the mud, the machinery, everything became part of the nightmare, with evidence so gruesome and fragmented that the full count of his victims may never be known. For years, families of Vancouver's missing women pleaded with police to take their cases seriously, but the cries were too often ignored. Many of the victims came from the downtown east side, a neighborhood struggling with poverty, drug addiction, and systemic neglect. When women disappeared, it was all too easy for authorities to dismiss them as having moved on or vanished by choice. This institutional failure gave Robert Pickton cover to operate in plain sight. He would cruise the neighborhood in his pickup truck, offering drugs, money, or shelter, knowing desperation made his targets vulnerable. One by one, he brought them back to his Port Coquitlam pig farm, a place isolated enough that screams would never carry beyond the fences, a place where decades of filth and waste provided the perfect cover for disposal. For years, whispers circulated about strange things happening on the farm. Some who knew Pickton described him as disheveled, smelling of pigs and decay, yet always willing to party, offering drugs to lure women and friends alike. The farm became notorious for wild gatherings, but underneath the noise was a darker reality. Women who entered rarely left. It wasn't until 1997, when Pickton was charged with the attempted murder of a woman who narrowly escaped his farm, that authorities came close to exposing him. But the case collapsed when the victim, struggling with trauma and addiction, was deemed an unreliable witness. Pickton walked free, and the killings continued. It wasn't until 2002, after police executed a search warrant on the farm in an unrelated weapons investigation, that the horrifying truth began to surface. Officers discovered personal belongings of missing women scattered on the property, clothing, identification, purses, and soon the largest forensic investigation in Canadian history was underway. Cadaver dogs combed the fields, soil was sifted, pig troughs inspected, machinery dismantled. What investigators found was nightmarish. Human remains intermingled with pig remains, bone fragments so small and degraded they required months of analysis to identify. The farm became a crime scene that seemed endless, a place where years of horror had been concealed beneath the muck. The scope of the evidence overwhelmed even veteran investigators. By the time the investigation concluded, Pickton had been charged with the murders of 26 women, though he boasted to an undercover officer that he had killed 49, and investigators believed the true number could be higher. Families who had begged for answers for years were finally confronted with the unbearable truth. Their loved ones had been taken to a pig farm and never returned. The trial of Robert Pickton was one of the most disturbing spectacles in Canadian legal history, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the revelations about how long he had been allowed to operate unchecked. In 2007, after years of forensic work, Pickton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder, though evidence tied him to many more. The decision to limit the charges was a practical one. The trial had already consumed years, and prosecutors feared that presenting the full scope would overwhelm the jury and delay justice indefinitely. Even so, the evidence that did reach the courtroom was harrowing. Witnesses described Pickton's boasts about his killings, including his claim that he wanted to make it to an even 50 before stopping. Forensic experts explained how they painstakingly recovered fragments of bone, teeth, and DNA from the farm, often intermingled with pig remains, leaving the full body count uncertain. Families of victims filled the courtroom, forced to listen to the gruesome details of how their daughters, sisters, and mothers had been discarded in a place that treated human life as refuse. Pickton himself showed little emotion throughout the proceedings, his gaunt frame and flat expressions betraying neither remorse nor empathy. For many, the greatest outrage was not just his crimes, but the fact that they had been preventable. Years earlier, when women first began disappearing, police had ignored warning signs, failed to follow up on tips, and dismissed victims because of their vulnerable backgrounds. In the aftermath, public inquiries condemned these failures, forcing Canada to reckon with systemic prejudices that had allowed a serial killer to thrive for so long. Pickton was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the harshest sentence available under Canadian law. Yet for the families of the missing, it was a hollow victory. Justice came too late, and too many bodies remained unidentified, their final moments buried forever in the mud of that farm. Pickton's legacy remains not only the horror of his crimes, but the reminder that society's most vulnerable are too often invisible, left unprotected until it is far too late. And while Canada grappled with the aftermath of his cruelty across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom would soon discover that not all killers fit the mold of troubled men with long histories of abuse. In 2013, a woman named Joanna Dennehy shattered every expectation by murdering not for gain or desperation, but for thrill. A rare female serial killer who stalked her victims with the cold glee of a predator who killed simply because she enjoyed it. When investigators think of serial killers, they almost always picture men. Statistically, that image is accurate. The overwhelming majority of documented serial killers are male. But in 2013, the United Kingdom was forced to confront a chilling exception: Joanna Dennehy, a woman who murdered not out of necessity, greed, or desperation, but for the sheer thrill of it. Dennehy was born in 1982 in St. Albans, England, and by all accounts, her early life did not foreshadow the horrors she would later unleash. She came from a relatively ordinary family, attended school, and seemed destined for a life no different from countless others. But beneath the surface, there was an instability that began to crack through in her teenage years. She drifted into a lifestyle defined by rebellion, drugs, and reckless relationships. Those who knew her described her as manipulative, unpredictable, and drawn to chaos. By her late 20s, she was deeply immersed in addiction and instability, moving through different towns, leaving behind fractured relationships and trails of destruction. What set Dennehy apart from other female offenders was not simply her willingness to kill, but her reason for doing it. When she embarked on her killing spree in March of 2013, she admitted later that she did it because she found it exciting, even fun. Her victims were men, chosen almost arbitrarily, stabbed with such ferocity that investigators believed she enjoyed the intimacy of close-contact murder. She killed 3 men within 10 days in and around Peterborough, leaving their bodies in ditches, their deaths shocking not only for their brutality, but for the complete lack of motive. Dennehy herself later admitted she felt no remorse, no sorrow, only exhilaration. She would go on to tell psychiatrists and prison staff that killing gave her a rush, that she wanted to know what it felt like, and once she began, she didn't want to stop. For Britain, the case was deeply unsettling, not simply because of the murders, but because Dennehy broke the narrative of what society thought a female killer looked like. She wasn't poisoning quietly in kitchens like Belle Gunness or Mary Ann Cotton before her. She wasn't killing for profit or convenience. She was doing it for pleasure, and that made her one of the rarest and most terrifying kinds of killers. Someone who murdered for the thrill of the hunt. The investigation into Joanna Dennehy's crimes quickly revealed just how deliberate and chilling her spree had been. Her 3 confirmed victims, Łukasz Slaboszewski, John Chapman, and Kevin Lee, were men she encountered in Peterborough in March of 2013. Slaboszewski was a 31-year-old man she lured with promises of companionship. Chapman, a 56-year-old housemate at a property she frequented, and Lee, a 48-year-old property developer and landlord with whom she had a complicated relationship. Each man was stabbed repeatedly, their bodies dumped in ditches outside the city like discarded refuse. What made the killings especially shocking was not only their speed, 3 murders in just 10 days, but Dennehy's demeanor afterward. She did not flee, panic, or attempt to cover her tracks in ways typical of killers. Instead, she treated the murders like a game, laughing, joking, and bragging to those around her. Witnesses recalled her boasting about her crimes, showing no sign of remorse, and describing the killings as if she had been acting out a fantasy. Even more chilling, Dennehy later admitted she specifically chose male victims because she did not want to kill women. "I don't kill women," she reportedly said. "I like men to look frightened." Her words revealed the sadistic core of her crimes. She didn't just enjoy killing, she relished the fear she inflicted in her victims during their final moments. Investigators discovered she had even sought to kill more, enlisting 2 accomplices, Gary Stretch and Leslie Layton, who helped her with transportation and concealment. Together, they traveled through the countryside, with Dennehy reportedly seeking additional victims simply to satisfy her compulsion. This recklessness ultimately led to her capture. Police arrested her on April 2, 2013, after a nationwide search. Yet even in custody, Dennehy remained defiant and unsettling. During her trial, she smiled, joked, and displayed none of the remorse expected from someone accused of such brutal crimes. Psychiatrists later diagnosed her with psychopathic, antisocial, and borderline personality disorders, describing her as a woman who killed purely for excitement, a rare case among women who typically commit murder for financial gain or revenge. For the families of her victims, Dennehy's demeanor was like a second cruelty, a reminder that their loved ones had died not in a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion, but in a predator's game played for amusement. When Joanna Dennehy finally stood trial in 2013, the British public was transfixed not only by the brutality of her crimes, but by the shocking absence of remorse she displayed at every stage. Unlike other defendants who break down, plead insanity, or attempt to justify their actions, Dennehy leaned into her infamy. She laughed during hearings, joked with officers, and at times seemed almost proud of what she had done. In December of that year, she pleaded guilty to all 3 murders and 2 attempted murders without hesitation, as if daring the court to punish her. Psychiatrists described her as a psychopath with no empathy and no moral compass, a woman who derived pleasure from violence and domination. Judge Mr. Justice Spencer, in sentencing her, called her crimes exceptionally grave and noted she had killed for your own personal gratification. Dennehy was handed a whole life tariff, a rare sentence in the UK that ensured she would never be released. She became only the 3rd woman in British history, after Myra Hindley and Rose West, to receive such a punishment. For the families of Łukasz Slaboszewski, John Chapman, and Kevin Lee, justice provided little comfort. The randomness of the murders and the sheer cruelty of Dennehy's indifference made their loss all the harder to bear. What unsettled the public most was not simply that a woman had killed, but that she had done so with the kind of reckless pleasure typically associated with the most sadistic male predators. She shattered stereotypes about female killers, showing that evil can take any form, wear any face, and strike without warning. Her case remains one of the most chilling examples in recent UK history of a killer who murdered not for money, revenge, or necessity, but purely for thrill. Placed alongside Peter Manuel, who crept into homes in 1950s Scotland, and Robert Pickton, who turned his Canadian pig farm into a graveyard, Joanna Dennehy completes a trio of killers whose stories remind us that true terror does not belong to one era, one country, or one type of person. It hides everywhere, waiting for the moment when trust fails and danger reveals itself too late. Evil doesn't follow rules. Peter Manuel slipped into homes where families thought they were safe. Robert Pickton turned a farm into a graveyard, preying on the forgotten. Joanna Dennehy killed for the thrill, smiling as she confessed. 3 killers, 3 masks, but the same truth: terror hides in plain sight. If these stories shocked you, subscribe now and tell me in the comments which case left you speechless.